Hello, Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
How are you?
How are you? Good evening. I'm so thrilled to meet you, even if virtually, after all these years, particularly at this critical juncture in human history. An unprecedented pandemic, a deepening climate crisis, and other daunting challenges are testing the will and the wisdom of the humanity, for which you have made great contributions and you have become a symbol. Without further ado, let me invite you to share your thoughts on the enormous governance challenges of our time and how we can successfully overcome those challenges. Professor?
Thank you very much. Let me say what a great honor it is to be part of the Korea 2020 Forum. Dean Yu, it's a pleasure to be with you and an honor to be with you. And for all of the participants, I'm spending much of my time learning from Korea. So I'm very grateful because Korea is making some very, very important contributions to the whole world in how you have addressed this pandemic and in your plans for recovery from the pandemic. So I want to start by congratulations to Korea. I know the situation remains difficult, of course, everywhere. Even when the virus is brought under control, there are renewed outbreaks, and Korea is experiencing a surge of outbreaks right now. But from my understanding, there were about 750 new cases of COVID yesterday in Korea, while in the United States, there were more than 160,000 cases. So it's your success, even in this difficult phase, is remarkable. And we can learn a lot from governance, from what Korea has accomplished. I'm going to share my screen, if I can, and present just a few slides to help us orient. But I want to start out with these data on what is happening around the world. So this is a map of the new cases yesterday, measured as cases per million population. In Korea, there were about 14 cases per million. In the United States, more than 500 cases per million. So an extraordinary difference between our circumstances. What is notable in this map is not only Korea, but the Asia-Pacific region. China, Korea, Japan, the countries of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Australia, New Zealand, all have had relative success in suppressing the pandemic. If you look at the Western Hemisphere, from Canada and the United States, all the way through Latin America, down to Brazil and Argentina, it's pretty much bright red, meaning very high cases per million, hundreds of new cases per million each day. If you look at Europe, the situation is largely out of control, stretching all the way from Spain and Portugal, and then across Europe and across Russia. So, in fact, there only are two regions where the virus has been largely suppressed, and that is the Asia-Pacific region and tropical Africa. We don't know exactly whether the situation in tropical Africa is an accurate reflection. It may be that the situation is worse, but with much less testing, or it may be that Africa's tropical environment, outdoor environment, rural areas are somehow contributing to a lower level of transmission of the disease. But the first lesson of governance that I would emphasize is the success of the Asia-Pacific region. This is a governance success. You know the story in detail, of course, for Korea, that from the first moments of this pandemic, the Korean government worked effectively with the public and with the biotech companies. Korea came up with tests for COVID almost immediately, 6 companies. Korea rolled out large-scale testing. Korea rolled out large-scale tracing, contact tracing, and quarantine. Korea quickly rolled out new information technology applications. Not everything worked perfectly. There was the very large outbreak in Daegu, but soon the virus was brought under control. And I would say that this experience showed a serious government, high professionalism, and a serious public that was cooperative, that is very savvy online, well-connected, using apps with great facility. And so there was a high level of trust, at least relative to my country, in the control of the pandemic. In the United States, it's been completely the opposite. First, we had a president who was totally out of control, anti-scientific, uninterested in professionalism. We had a failure of the testing equipment for critical months, where Korea scaled up the tests. We failed in the United States terribly. The first test equipment sent by our CDC was faulty, and it was not fixed for many months. We still have a shortage of testing equipment until today. We never implemented at the national level until today a tracing and isolating system at the national level. We have some cities, some states that have some measure of contact tracing. But as a national system, we have none. We never implemented national scale information technology. And we don't even have a national registry or national system for monitoring, nor any kind of control of movement of population, even when we are reaching almost 200,000 new cases each day, and sometimes more than 200,000 new cases. So all of this is to say, congratulations, first of all. Second, the whole Asia-Pacific region is better governed than other parts of the world. And that is also a strong consideration, I think, for Korea's own strategy, because you are part of a neighborhood that works. And as I will emphasize in a few minutes, the regional cooperation within Asia, Korea, Japan, China, ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand, in my opinion, is a very strong basis for cooperation and for economic recovery and for the design of many long-term strategies. So I am a big fan of the RCEP group, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership group of 15 countries, and one of my major messages would be to use RCEP effectively. Don't let the United States divide Asia into pro-China, anti-China. Rather, Asia should become a strong partnership within Asia for the benefit of the Asia Pacific, and I would say for the benefit of the whole world, because a strong Asia Pacific is very supportive of a strong world. So let me elaborate on these points quickly. We've looked at yesterday's cases, and if we tell the same story looking at the cumulative cases during the entire pandemic, we find the same phenomenon, that the Asia-Pacific region has done very well, whereas the Americas and Europe have done quite poorly. Now is the question of building back better, and that's where the Korean New Deal comes in. So I believe that building back better should be based on two major considerations: the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Climate Agreement. Of course, the Sustainable Development Goals are the globally agreed framework for a holistic society strategy that addresses economic, social, and environmental needs. The idea of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals is to promote the economy, to ensure social inclusion, and to achieve environmental sustainability. I like this holistic approach, and I think that the 17 Sustainable Development Goals are very useful guidelines. Now, when I look at how Korea is doing on these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, of course, Korea is one of the world leaders in achieving the SDGs, but there are areas of concern. And let me mention a few of the strengths and some of the weaknesses. The great strength, I think, is Korea's educational system. And this, I would say, together with Korea's culture, has been the most important long-term source of Korea's success. Korean people are well educated, highly skilled, and therefore able to continue to innovate technologically, and that is where Korea's great economic strength comes from as well. In the most recent rankings of performance of high school students, Korea came in 6th in the world. And all of the countries but one are East Asian countries. So the rankings in this test was China, but that's just a few big cities. That is Beijing, Shanghai, and a couple of other cities. Then Singapore, then Macau, Hong Kong, then Estonia, so one country in Europe, then Japan and Korea tied. So this is the strength of the East Asian region: excellence of education with strong skills in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And of course, that propels the East Asian region as one of the centers of global technological dynamism. Korea also does very well in health scores, not only in the pandemic, but life expectancy in Korea is one of the highest in the world. It's ranked 9th in the world in WHO's data for 2018, 82.8 years of life expectancy. That's about 3 years longer than the United States. And again, it is heavily the East Asian countries that are at the top of the league. So this is another strong point. Now here's an area where Korea does not as well. SDG 10 is about inequality. Korea is not a highly unequal country, but it is not one of the more equal countries either. It's somewhere in the middle. I'm showing you with the red arrow where Korea's Gini coefficient is compared to other OECD countries. So the more equal countries are the Northern European countries like Denmark or Norway or Sweden. The less equal countries are my own, the United States, of course, Mexico, Chile. Korea is on the higher side, not extreme inequality, but also not low inequality. So I think this is one area to work on. Another place where Korea does not do very well is gender equality, SDG 5. And one measure of gender equality is women in politics. So in the parliament, this is as of the start of 2020, the proportion of women in the Korean parliament was 17%. This is definitely not an outstanding figure. It's not the lowest in the world, but it is not very high. And so this is an area, gender equality, also wage differentials, women in the labor force, where I think Korea could be guided by the SDGs in higher performance. Now, other areas which you know well where Korea needs progress is in the environmental side. And Korea faces major environmental challenges. One, of course, is that Korea is largely a fossil fuel-based economy, coal, oil, and natural gas. And so Korea has a long way to go in reducing carbon emissions to reach the new goal of net zero by 2050. In 2018, Korea emitted 12.9 tons per person, which is, again, not the highest in the world, but on the high side, higher than Europe, lower than the United States, quite high. But that's because renewable energy has played a quite small role in Korea up until now. And another area where the whole East Asian coastline of the heavy industry suffers environmentally is in air quality. So we know that air quality in Seoul and in other cities in Korea is less good than it should be. And this is true, of course, of the whole Pacific coastline of the East Asian countries. Also, you see India, a lot of air pollution, a lot of environmental quality improvement that would come from decarbonizing the energy system. One other place where Korea does not perform as well as it can is in overall sense of well-being. I edit each year the World Happiness Report with colleagues, so I'm a co-editor, and we rank countries according to the survey undertaken by Gallup, asking people about their life satisfaction. And based on that survey, Korea comes out around 60th in the world on reported life satisfaction. Now, interpreting that is a challenge because I think in Korea's wonderful culture, as well as some of the neighboring countries, people perhaps don't want to say that they're the happiest. It may be a cultural response to the survey, but I also think that it reflects stresses of life in Korea that are quite real. There's a lot of pressure, of course, on young people. There's a lot of pressure in society. And I think that one part of sustainable development to focus on then is raising well-being. as reported by people themselves, what we call subjective well-being. The countries that rate happiest in the world are the Northern European countries: Finland, Denmark, Switzerland, Iceland, Norway, Netherlands, Sweden. So the first 7 countries are all Northern European countries. And these are countries with low inequality, high quality of life, a lot of attention to the environment, and a major social welfare system to reduce the anxieties that people have. But there's another aspect to this well-being that I wanted to bring to your attention, which you know, and that is work hours. Korean people work very hard, really very, very hard, compared to all of the rest of the OECD. This is a graph of work hours on average per worker during the year from all of the OECD countries. You can see the red arrow. Koreans work on average 1,987 hours per year. I think this is for 2018. In Sweden, the same year, the work hours was 1,452. So remarkably, Swedes worked 500 hours per year per worker less than in Korea. And that is more than 10 work weeks, because Swedes take a lot of vacation. And probably this is part of the happiness in Northern Europe. But I would say one thing that Korea has earned is a bit more leisure time than it is taking. I don't want Koreans to become lazy, because the hard work has really paid off. But I do think that Korea probably, with all of the new wealth and the productivity, has the chance to ease the work hours, increase the vacation time, increase the quality of life of Korean people. And that should also be part of the Sustainable Development Goals, because well-being is one of the principal aims. And so I would take seriously the fact that the Korean people report that they are more stressed and less happy than would be reflected by the high incomes and the economic successes. Now, Korea is embarking on a New Deal, and this is absolutely wonderful news, and it's already helping to encourage other countries to do the same. And all of the SDGs and the environmental goals should be seen in terms of the global diplomatic agenda as well. There are several important summit meetings this coming year that where Korea can play a leadership role. Of course, probably the most notable is the Paris Climate Agreement, which will be in November in Glasgow, Scotland. And that is the time when Korea will set out its new nationally determined contribution, its enhanced contribution, based on the Korean Green Deal, based on reaching net zero emissions by 2050. In May, there will be an important meeting in Kunming, China, on conserving biodiversity. And again, this is an area where Korea can do more to protect biodiversity, both within the Korean Peninsula, but also in the global supply chains and the oceans. There will be in September next year a World Food System Summit for sustainability of the global food system. Koreans eat healthy diets and eat well and live long lives, so you're part of food sustainability, but to ensure that the global supply chains are sustainable is an area where Korea can play an important role. And then in April this coming year in Lisbon will be the world's ocean summits. So I would encourage you to put the Korean New Deal in the context of the rapidly evolving global diplomacy. As you know, Korea is part now of a global movement of countries that have committed to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And this includes Europe, 27 countries of Europe, because Europe has adopted the European Green Deal. It includes the United Kingdom and Ireland. It includes China now, which has committed to net zero by 2060. It includes Japan. It includes New Zealand. And with President Biden coming to office on January 20, President Biden will commit the United States to net zero by 2050, and President Biden will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is attempting to put together a full global consensus so that by the time countries reach the Glasgow COP26 in November, all countries of the world should be committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2050, because that's what climate safety requires. That is our only hope for keeping global warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius compared with the pre-industrial level. This slide explains the European Green Deal, which includes decarbonization, sustainable land use, and circular economy. So it's got several major dimensions. This slide explains the Biden plan for climate. And of course, this slide explains Korea's New Deal, which I personally think is extremely well designed from what I've seen, because it has two basic pillars, both of which are extremely correct: the digital pillar and the renewable energy or zero carbon pillar. And all of that is underpinned by a strong safety net. So to my mind, the Korean New Deal puts together the right pieces for this kind of sustainable development approach. And I also very much appreciate the detailed structure of the Korean New Deal, including infrastructure, low carbon energy, and innovation in green industry, because Korea is a leading power in innovation and in green chemistry, and also on the digital side, where Korea is certainly, if not the world's leader, one of the world's leaders of putting the new 5G into the core of governance, into the core of infrastructure. And this combination is extremely strong and also carefully budgeted. So I am impressed by the overall formulation of the Korean Green Deal. Now, what I would like to know better and like to see better is the pathway for Korea to achieve the Korean New Deal. Specifically, what is the energy mix that the government aims to achieve in order to reach net zero? How much nuclear, how much carbon capture and storage, how much renewable energy, wind and solar, will formulate Korea's primary energy sources of the future. What you're seeing here is a diagram showing a model for the US transformation that my team and I just released a few weeks ago. The idea is to design a pathway between now and 2050 to reach net zero emissions. I've not seen such pathway analysis for Korea's decarbonization strategy, but I think it's a very high priority, because Korea should have a very clear view, of course, and probably you do of what are the underlying technology transformations ahead. And this will be important for strategies on nuclear or strategies on carbon capture and storage and so on. What's clear is that we are going to zero carbon power and electric transport. This is very clear. And it's also clear that we will go to green fuels, for example, hydrogen cycle, for parts of the industry, for example, in steel making, with the hydrogen produced by the zero carbon electricity. So Korea will do itself a favor and the world a favor by laying out what this pathway is. And this is just another example of a Japanese pathway analysis. Another point that I would emphasize is that regional cooperation in energy interconnection will be a big help. And so one can imagine China, Korea, Japan interconnected through submarine cable, sharing zero carbon power, and by making a larger interconnected market, lowering the overall costs of reaching net zero emissions. So I believe that regional cooperation is extremely important for this. This slide discusses the Convention on Biological Diversity for the Kunming, China meeting. It's basically about land use and ocean use. And again, all countries need a strategy for biodiversity conservation, for land use, and for the sustainability of their food supply chains globally. And this is another area where I think more research work is needed to ensure that our land use and food systems are sustainable and resilient. We will have the Food Systems Summit, as I mentioned, in September 2021. And this also defines a policy agenda, which is quite complex because it's to mix land use, nutrition, livelihoods, and resiliency in a coherent systems approach to food availability and access. And we have a lot of analytical work to do to achieve that kind of food system sustainability. Now, let me close by just a few observations about the region, and specifically the 15 countries of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. To my mind, this new agreement signed a few weeks ago is a very exciting agreement because it links together China, Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and the 10 countries of ASEAN into a trading group. And I like it very much because, first of all, geography determines trade to a very large extent. So this is a natural group for high-level trade. It's also a very major group. It's almost 30% of world output, 30% of world trade, and 30% of the world population. I also like it because it brings cooperation with China in a way that is not merely a bilateral issue, but is a multilateral issue. And I am personally very much in favor of good cooperation with China and trying to avoid the kinds of tensions that have been rising with China during the Trump administration. I believe that China can be a good neighbor and a good trading partner and a very dynamic innovator as well, and therefore part of the East Asian innovation region, which is one of the most innovative parts of the planet and therefore one of the most competitive parts of the planet. And I would like to see this region more integrated because I think it will be very good for the people of the region and also very good for the global economy as well. In the United States, that's not the usual view. The usual view is that we're trying to oppose China and trying to keep Korea and Japan on the US side against China. But I think that that is an extremely naive point of view. And I believe in regional cooperation and regional integration much more. It's also the case that Korea is already so deeply integrated with China, the major export destination for Korea, as are the other countries of the neighborhood. And so it makes perfect sense for Korea to make a major investment in the RCEP region, not exclusively because Korea has major markets in the United States, in Europe, and so on, but RCEP is the natural major market for Korea, and therefore good close collaboration and cooperation with China, with ASEAN, with Japan, I think all makes a great deal of sense. And a special feature of that is that because this region has done so well in containing the pandemic, the RCEP region really can be and should be the first major region of the world to escape from the pandemic and to reopen trade within the region. And of course, Korea's export structure is so sophisticated and so high-tech, both in advanced engineering and also especially in digital technologies, that there's going to be an unending booming market in this new digital and renewable space. And RCEP is a huge market for this kind of change. Think of all of the transformation investment needed in China in the coming years, or think of all of the new infrastructure needed in the ASEAN region. And so I think that there's a fantastic market for Korea ahead in the regional cooperation. Let me just end by saying that, of course, business has a big role to play in this agenda. It is the key for generating the new technologies, for making the new markets, for building the new infrastructure. And each business also has a responsibility for making its own New Deal, its own Green Deal. Businesses need to report on their sustainable development performance. And I wanted to highlight in closing that there are many initiatives underway for increased reporting standards for major businesses on green investment, global reporting, carbon disclosure, new standards on financial disclosure of climate risk, and so forth. And it will be good for Korean business to become engaged in this kind of reporting. Korea has some of the leading brand names in the world, and the Korean businesses should be in the forefront of reporting and performing on sustainable development. So let me stop here just to conclude by saying that Korea has shown extraordinary governance in this pandemic, and the platform for recovery, digital and renewable, is the correct platform, and the regional base for recovery is a strong one. So I'm very optimistic, I hope I may be permitted to say. And again, I want to end by congratulating Korea on its very strong performance in a very, very difficult year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that illuminating and inspiring and somehow heartwarming lecture. I hope we can all share in with your optimism, and I'd like to start with a couple of questions that we have collected from the Korean press beforehand. And because, you know, the reporters are more, you know, their time horizon is slightly shorter than us.
2050.
So this is about rather near-term economic prospects. And one of the, I thought it was courteous for me to not wear a mask when I am talking to you, but I'm just being asked to put on my mask.
Good.
I thought I was in safe distance from the audience, but
very appropriate, no problem.
So one of the consequences of the pandemic and the economic policy responses to it has been a very dramatic decoupling or divergence between financial markets and real activities. Asset prices are soaring and growth and employment are souring in South Korea as well as in many other parts of the world. As a result, the gap between the rich and poor are widening even more, and the working people are increasingly demoralized. And there are worries about the sustainability of this financial and social aspects of this decoupling. We may get some, you know, moment of financial reckoning if the recovery is delayed, or when the recovery comes, there may be inflation and associated disruptions. So given these worries, what is your view on this, and what would be your policy advice to Korean government and in fact, other governments that are facing similar problems?
I think it's a very tricky situation, of course, but trickier in the US and Europe because the pandemic is still so strong. And so Germany is going into another lockdown now. New York City is probably going to go into another lockdown in the next few days. We could have a second dip, and Europe certainly is going to have a very bad fourth quarter and bad beginning of next year. So the situation, first of all, depends on containing the pandemic. And therefore, I really hope that Korea can get this most recent increase under control decisively and get back to the very low levels that Korea achieved for several months, because that obviously allows for daily life to continue more normally. Monetary policy has been extremely easy in the United States and Europe. Easy is not even the word. Massively expansionary, with huge budget deficits and huge increase of the money supply. And that is pumping up the equity markets. So I'm a bit nervous. And I think that we definitely have asset price inflation. It's not impossible we would have some goods price inflation as well, maybe in foodstuffs and in even housing prices are up in the United States overall. So I am a bit worried about this, not panicked, but will be more worried if we don't get the epidemic under control. Fortunately, today was the start of vaccine implementation in the United States, although that's going to take many months. But this is a good sign because at least we have some apparent good news on the vaccine side, even though our public health management has been horrible. Maybe this will help the recovery. So all to say, I would be cautious and believe that there is limited space for macroeconomic expansion. I am not of the view that we should just continue to pump in as much money as possible because I do worry about the financial situation. I would also add one more obvious point, which is that some of the huge stock market increase is a reflection of the success of the big digital companies, which are now about 1/4 of the major market indexes. And so there's a misrepresentation in the stock market because we don't see the declining sectors, we only see the growing sectors reflected in the stock market right now. And we do have a boom in the digital sectors, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Tesla, and other leading edge sectors. Maybe a little bit of a bubble there also, but probably a realistic picture. Now, when it comes to the longer term income distributional consequences, at least in the US scene, we're losing a lot of jobs in the brick and mortar economy and a lot of shift to e-commerce and to online services. And so there is definitely a longer term income distributional shift underway. And I think that this has to be attended to by adequate redistributional policies. Certainly unemployment insurance, that's a minimum, but also job retraining and new job creation in building the new digital and green economy. So I think a jobs strategy makes sense. Income support for those who may have lost their jobs or lost their source of income also makes sense. And again, building a macroeconomic framework for the Korean Green Deal that looks 5 to 10 years and considers an overall budgetary framework. I would ask a question in that analysis, and that's whether Korea should aim to gradually increase the overall tax revenues collected in order to bolster some of the redistributional services of the government. That's a question. I don't know the answer to that, but it is the kind of medium-term budget analysis that I think is important.
Well, you have pointed to the concerns about long-term distributional consequences of the pandemic and its aftermath. And actually, another question that I wanted to raise was precisely about that. There has been a heated debate in Korea in relation to the way in which we provide emergency aid in the context of the pandemic, whether it should be given to everybody or targeted to low-income classes or the hardest hit. And even for a longer-term, system issue, which is about the introduction of universal basic income. There are growing voices about the need to introduce universal basic income, particularly because more and more people are working without this traditional employment contract and lacking in adequate social protection, therefore. So what is your take on these issues?
Yeah, so in general, I think that more social support is almost surely needed, but it can come in a variety of ways. So partly every rich country, including Korea now is a rich country, should have, of course, universal health coverage and universal education funding through a high level, so that poor households have access to health and education irrespective of income levels. I think a lot of that is already in place, but there could be more that needs to be done. Then I think that there is also an important opportunity to improve the quality of jobs for Korean people. I mentioned, but I don't know the institutional detail, I mentioned the case for more leisure time, more guaranteed vacation time. I'm pretty sure that that is warranted as part of overall reform to improve the quality of life of people. How exactly to implement it and to fund it, I'm not sure, because I don't know enough about the Korean labor market. But I do know that part of the way that higher quality of life will be achieved is by enabling Korean people across the board to have more vacation time, more leisure time, and so on. I think that there is quite likely a case for improving the net of tax pay for lower wage workers as part of an income redistributional system as well. And I think that that kind of policy would make sense. I'm not so much in favor of universal basic income as a specific device where everybody gets a certain amount of won per month, because that's quite expensive. And I think that not that Korean people are going to stop working, but I do think that able-bodied people should work reasonable amount and have reasonable remuneration for that. And I'm not myself persuaded that everybody should just get a check no matter what. If people are disabled, if they are unemployed, if they are very poor, then certainly. But just a general distribution of funds to everybody, I think, is fiscally very difficult, and probably there are other priorities before doing that.
Well, I happen to agree with you on that, but I have actually so many questions that I want to ask you, but this one, you had a very high opinion of RCEP, and you know, underscored its importance. And in that context, you also said that we should not let the United States divide Asia into pro-China and anti-China camp. And actually, for us Koreans, we are in a bind because we feel the pressure from the U.S. to, you know, side with the U.S. and, you know, oppose China, and it's really difficult for us to do that, and it's not desirable, you know, as you said. And, you know, I really appreciate your being the voice of reason and conscience on this matter. But apart from your own position, given the mood of the United States, you know, how the U.S. establishment is thinking in this matter, do you see a significant change coming under the Biden administration in terms of China policy? And when we do get this pressure from the U.S. In our relations with China, what can we do? Do you have any advice on that?
Yeah. So the Biden administration will be much better than the Trump administration on everything. Trump was our most irresponsible president in our modern history. Really incompetent and unpleasant man. Today, the Electoral College voted for Biden, so that's
congratulations.
over. That's exactly. We still have 1 month and 6 days remaining of Trump. I'm counting down the days. He's not. It's not safe while he is in office, but the time is ending quickly. Now, Biden is a reasonable and rational man, and that is the starting point for a much better situation. And his foreign policy team, of course, is more established and experienced. And Pompeo, in my opinion, was our worst Secretary of State, along with our worst president. He had a very crusader, evangelical view of things that was very unrealistic, in my view. I don't think he knew very much history or perspective. So we will have a good, experienced Secretary of State. Now, having said all of that, the mood in the United States remains very bipartisan, anti-China. And so Biden will be cautious politically. And of course, the Americans do not have a very deep understanding of things. So they think that all of China's success came because China stole everything, which is not true. China was very clever. It bought a lot of technology, it learned a lot of technology, it copied a lot of technology, but basically there's a lot of homegrown expertise and innovation. And China is increasingly a technological powerhouse. So too, fortunately, is Korea and Japan. And the three countries together is probably the most powerful, innovating part of the whole world economy now, which is very exciting. And I think something to nurture in Asia, because it's a very strong point of cooperation. So the situation will not be simple, but I think it's important to try to establish deeper institutional foreign economic policy mechanisms, including between Korea and the US, but also within RCEP, for example, to try to institutionalize an ongoing dialogue process so that RCEP can't just be pushed easily aside, or the US trying to talk Korea into, the alternative trade bloc without China, which is ridiculous, in my opinion, because China is the most important trading country in Asia. So how could you have a trade agreement without China? But that's what Obama wanted also. I just found it ludicrous, actually, the whole idea of it. So to my mind, RCEP is a good place for Korea to help propel, because it's not bilateral. It is multilateral, and it's high stakes for everybody. Also, Korea's relations with all the neighbors have historic challenges, or especially, also with Japan. Having a multilateral setting, but that builds the strong regional cooperation, to my mind, is the right approach. And what I will recommend to the US authorities, some of whom are my friends still, is to try to deepen the bilateral discussions with China so that it is not on the basis of personalized, abrupt tweets, but is much more systematic, looking for a long-term, stable future relations and set of policies, because the U.S. also needs a stable relationship with China, not a hostile relationship, but a stable relationship. And I think it's just going to be important for everybody to educate Americans that there cannot be another Cold War. We must not go in that direction. The world is already dangerous enough, and the United States is way past the era when it is the world leader. That was 30 years ago. But right now, we have a multilateral world, and we need it to be based on cooperation, on rules, on the UN system, on regional cooperation, and on systematic long-term relations. So that's what I'm going to try to emphasize to the Biden administration. I'm not entirely optimistic because it's within 4 years, we went from normal, more or less normal relations with China to editorials that call China the enemy, which is ridiculous, very sad. But we have to now try to restabilize things and take a longer term constructive view. And part of that constructive view can come around the green deals that we're all going to have, because that's an area for very important cooperation. Also, Europe, I think, can play geopolitically a more stabilizing role, because Europe too should not break with China or try to create some kind of block. And I think that this is another diplomatic opportunity to keep the world open, multilateral, stable, and working together to solve big problems like climate change.
Well, thank you very much for your really insightful answers. I know it's getting very late for you, but I cannot resist asking just one more question. Would that be okay?
Of course. With
yeah,
pleasure.
I was invited to a meeting yesterday called Korean Peninsula Infrastructure Forum. And in that meeting, I suggested to people, I don't know much about infrastructure, but they were all very much keen on, improving inter-Korea relations and reconnecting North Korea and South Korea in terms of infrastructure. And I suggested that maybe this Green Deal, which is not just South Korean initiative, but this is the whole world is going in that direction and should be going in that direction. And in this context, maybe we can help. And electricity, especially, is a big constraint that North Korea is facing. So I suggested that maybe we can find some room. And you, during your talk, you mentioned the need for regional cooperation in East Asia in terms of energy interconnections in the path towards decarbonization. And that just struck me. Maybe, can we somehow include North Korea in that regional cooperation? And this, given the extremely strong sanctions regime, we have very little room to do anything with North Korea as of now, but can we have an opening in there? Or what do you think?
I think it's a very, very good idea. And there's a project in China, Beijing-based, that was started by the China State Grid, and now it's an independent organization called the Global Energy Interconnection Development Cooperation Organization, GEIDCO, GuideCo. And I work quite a bit with GuideCo. They have a very good idea. And what GuideCo is doing, it's basically a group of Chinese engineers. They're analyzing the technical dimensions of energy interconnection and using long-distance transmission, usually high voltage direct current, long-distance transmission to connect renewable energy sources at a large scale by hundreds or thousands of kilometers. And I think it would be very important for Japan, Korea, both the Republic of Korea and DPRK and China to look at what kind of options there are for the long-term regional integration of zero-carbon energy sources, and including North Korea as part of those discussions. It does seem to me that this whole strategy of sanctions needs rethinking. That's a complicated topic, but certainly it should be possible to analyze regional infrastructure, how China's Green Deal or how China's equivalent, Korea, Japan, should work together. Now, Prime Minister Suga has committed Japan to net zero by 2050, China by 2060, President Moon and the Korean New Deal by 2050. That's a great opportunity for regional discussion, because I'm sure that regional interconnections could help on that, and doing the pathways of what kind of regional investments would make sense would work. And it's pretty clear that North Korea would be part of any long-term infrastructure programming of that sort. So I think that that should be explored, and I've always believed that we should have openness for that kind of discussion at a minimum, so that we can understand each other and also understand really the prospects of cooperation and what they would bring and how the returns could be quite high. I know it's not so simple, but I do think that that should be possible, and it's a point that I think China, Japan, and ROK could all agree on and represent to the US, look, we need a regional discussion of these infrastructure issues.
Well, thank you so much for your time, your insights, wisdom, and more than anything else, your optimistic, heartwarming energy. I hope to see you again soon.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, and Happy New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year.